Inside the Library of Alexandria, the moon hung low above the great city of Alexandria, casting a pale silver glow across the rooftops, gardens, and winding streets. Along the broad avenues lined with columns and statues, soft footfalls echoed, quiet and deliberate, as if even the city itself was reluctant to disturb the stillness of the night. Within the palace district, behind towering marble walls and iron gates, the famed Library of Alexandria stood like a monument to eternity. Its spires and domes pierced the sky, and its porticos shimmered in the moonlight like the pages of a forgotten myth. Lanterns, set within ornate bronze brackets, cast a golden glow across the sandstone facade. Their flames barely flickered, protected from the sea breeze by clever glass shields. The silence around the structure was not born of emptiness, but of reverence. A lone figure approached the massive entrance, an elderly scribe named Hecateion. His sandals whispered against the stone walkway as he reached into the folds of his cloak to retrieve a key carved from ivory. The heavy doors groaned open with effort, revealing a vestibule lit by oil lamps. The smell of parchment and cedar wood filled the air, timeless and calming. Inside, the library breathed. It was not merely a building of stone and scrolls. It was alive with memory. Columns lined the grand hall, each bearing reliefs of gods and scholars. Niches in the walls held scrolls wrapped in linen, some written in Greek, others in Egyptian, Aramaic, Sanskrit, and tongues long lost. Wooden ladders stood ready beside tall shelves, and marble benches offered rest to the weary thinker. Hecateion made his way past the statues of Herodotus and Thales, whose stone eyes seemed to follow him as he passed. He entered a smaller chamber, the Hall of Maps, where globes, star charts, and ancient diagrams glowed under carefully placed lamps. He set his satchel down and drew from it a fresh scroll, newly arrived from the east. Carefully, almost lovingly, he placed it among others in a compartment labeled Astronomia. Outside, the sea hummed softly against the harbor walls. Inside, the air seemed to hum in harmony. Another figure appeared, a young apprentice named Diodora, carrying a clay tablet and stylus. She bowed quietly to the elder scribe before settling at a nearby desk. Her task tonight was to copy verses from Homer for a noble patron in Cyrene. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, even in the dim lamplight. "Master Hecateion," she whispered, careful not to disturb the stillness too much, "do you believe the stars speak to us?" The old man looked up from his scroll and smiled. "They speak," he said, "but not in words." A hush settled over them once more. In that vast sanctuary of knowledge, time seemed to slow, stretched thin by the weight of wisdom. Somewhere in the building, the steady drip of a fountain echoed like the ticking of a great celestial clock. Tonight, there would be no great discoveries, no thunderous debates, no shouting philosophers, only the silent dialogue between human thought and the mysteries of the universe, carried on in the turning of pages, the scratch of a stylus, the flicker of a lamp. And outside, Alexandria dreamed. In the upper galleries, where fewer visitors wandered, the air grew cooler. These were the oldest rooms, where the oldest scrolls lay, fragments of texts long vanished from other corners of the world, Atlantean myths, early Babylonian star records, sacred incantations from far corners of the Nile, rested in patient silence. Dust motes spun like galaxies in the slanted light of a solitary lamp. Diodora paused her copying, entranced by the quiet. "Master," she said softly again, "do you ever feel them watching us? Those who wrote all this, who lived so long ago." Hecateion looked toward a bust of an unknown scholar. Its features were smoothed with age, its identity lost. "Not watching," he said after a moment, "but waiting, hoping we listen." The young apprentice nodded, returning her gaze to the lines of verse. Her stylus scratched rhythmically like a heartbeat. In that vast temple of thought, she was no longer just a girl with a task. She was part of the great chain, preserving what others once dared to dream. As the night deepened over Alexandria, a gentle breeze slipped in through the high arched windows of the library, stirring the long-hanging drapes that framed the reading alcoves. Somewhere in the distance, a gull called into the darkness, its voice softened by the rhythmic hush of the sea. The lamps burned lower, their flames shrinking into blue-tipped flickers, but the library never truly slept. In the scriptorium, a vaulted chamber lined with cedar-paneled walls and inlaid with mosaics of stars and gods, a small assembly of scholars labored in silence. Some copied ancient texts onto fresh papyri. Others compared translations, their brows furrowed in concentration. A large bronze hourglass turned slowly at the center of the table, its fine white sand measuring the night in near-sacred precision. At one end of the hall, an old philosopher named Macaris sat in quiet contemplation. He held in his hands a tattered scroll attributed to Anaximander, one of the earliest thinkers to ponder the origins of life and the shape of the world. Macaris's fingers trembled slightly as he traced the faded lines, not from age, but from awe. A soft knock broke the hush. A young attendant entered, balancing a tray with figs, dates, and a pitcher of warm, diluted wine. He moved respectfully among the tables, careful not to spill or speak. When he passed Hecataeon, now seated near the central archive dome, he paused and whispered, "A visitor waits outside." Hecataeon raised an eyebrow. "At this hour?" The boy nodded. "He says he carries a gift from the island of Delos." Intrigued, Hecataeon rose and walked to the front entrance, where a man in a dark blue cloak stood beneath the torchlight. His hair was dusted with salt, and his skin bore the tan of long sea journeys. From his satchel, the man drew a cylinder made of horn and sealed with wax. "I am Chariton," he said, "a scribe in service to the temple of Apollo. This was meant for the great library." Hecataeon took the container with care, noting the intricate glyphs etched along its sides. "You've traveled far. Knowledge is worth it," Chariton replied simply. The two exchanged a respectful nod, and the traveler disappeared into the mist of the Alexandrian night. Back inside, the scroll was carefully unsealed and examined. It appeared to be a rare treatise on lunar cycles and their influence on agricultural rhythms, written in a dialect of Ionic Greek so old that it had to be compared against 3 other manuscripts. Scholars gathered, murmuring appreciatively. As the hourglass emptied again, Diodora returned to the scriptorium, her fingers stained with ink, her mind buzzing with questions. "Master Hecataeon," she whispered, "how do we know which truths to preserve?" He smiled gently. "We don't. That's why we preserve them all." The stars above the library glowed steadily, watching the minds below as they tended to their sacred fire, the quiet, unending work of remembrance. And in the endless night of Alexandria, the light of thought burned on. Later that evening, as the last hourglass was turned and the library's deeper halls grew even quieter, Hecataeon guided Diodora to a section rarely visited, the Vault of Origins. Hidden behind a heavy stone arch and sealed by a bronze door engraved with planetary symbols, the vault contained the oldest and most fragile scrolls, origin myths, pre-Socratic cosmologies, and fragments of thought penned before structured language. Fully formed, they stepped inside, the air cooler and scented with dust and time. Here, scrolls were stored in clay jars to protect them from the breath of time. Diodora peered at one jar labeled simply Mithra. Another read Ra and the Boat of Stars. She turned to her mentor, eyes wide. "These are dreams," she said. "Some dreams shape the waking world," Hecataeon replied. They spent an hour reading aloud from a creation tale of the Sumerians, piecing together the meaning from fractured lines and forgotten phrases. Outside, dawn began to stir in the east, casting a soft glow through the upper vents of the library's highest dome. By the time the first light touched the mosaic floors, Hecateion and Diodora emerged from the vault, their minds weighed down with wonder. The city would soon wake, but the library, eternal, timeless, would remain in its sacred night just a little longer, embracing the dreamers who sought its wisdom. As they extinguished the final lamp, a hush lingered, reverent and full of promise. In Alexandria, the night of thought was never truly over. As the golden horizon of dawn stretched over the rooftops of Alexandria, the library settled into its briefest moment of rest. Though many believed its halls to be busiest in the height of day, the hours just after sunrise held a special kind of silence, a sacred stillness filled not with absence, but with potential. The servants had begun their quiet tasks. Young assistants replaced the burned-out lamps with fresh oil, their motions graceful and practiced. The aroma of sandalwood and warm resin filled the main atrium, mingling with the ever-present scent of papyrus and ink. Outside the eastern colonnade, temple bells began to sound from a nearby sanctuary to Serapis, their tones low and haunting, like echoes from the underworld returning to the living. In the Hall of Poetry, where marble benches faced wide murals of Orpheus and Sappho, a visiting bard from Rhodes, named Iophon, reclined against a sun-warmed pillar, humming verses to himself as he copied a newly discovered lyric into his leather-bound book. He wrote not for money or for glory, but because he believed that even beauty deserved to be preserved. His fingers bore calluses from years of stylus work, and his sandals were worn thin, but his eyes gleamed with youth. Elsewhere, in the Hall of Medicine, 3 scholars gathered around a dissected scroll from India describing the properties of sacred roots. One of them, an Egyptian herbalist named Teneti, wore a necklace of lotus seeds and a robe dyed with the crimson of pomegranate skins. She spoke softly but firmly, translating the text into Greek for her colleagues. "This one," she said, pointing, "they say it slows the heart and makes the spirit quiet." A few corridors away, Hecateion entered the observatory chamber, a rotunda crowned with a polished dome and narrow openings that aligned with constellations. Bronze armillary spheres and star charts decorated the walls. He turned a dial to open one of the ceiling vents, allowing a sliver of morning light to project onto a large sundial embedded in the floor. Diodora followed shortly after, carrying with her a fresh roll of parchment and a small pouch of lapis-colored ink. Her eyes were heavy with sleep, but her mind sparkled with questions. As she entered, the light caught her face, and she looked upward with wonder. "This chamber," she whispered, "feels like the gods are listening." Hecateion nodded. "It was designed that way. Every star has its place, every beam of light its purpose." They spent the morning transcribing celestial observations recorded decades earlier by Babylonian astronomers, comparing them to the recent notes sent from Cyrenaica. With each notation, Diodora's script grew surer, her lines more elegant. When they paused for a short meal, figs, honeyed bread, and diluted wine, they spoke of dreams, not the kind found in sleep, but those woven from curiosity, hope, and longing. "Do you think we'll ever know all there is to know?" she asked. Hecateion shook his head, a warm smile softening his features. "No, but that is not our burden. It is our joy." The sun climbed higher. Outside, Alexandria awakened with noise and bustle. Inside, within those ancient walls, a gentler awakening was underway, a kindling of thought, a spark of timeless pursuit. In the margins of her parchment, Diodora began to sketch a diagram of stars, her own small addition to the library's ever-growing constellation of knowledge. And as the light shifted through the ceiling aperture, the diagram seemed to shimmer, like a memory not yet made. In Alexandria, the line between past and future was as thin as ink on parchment, and just as sacred As the meal ended and the parchments were gathered once more, a hush reclaimed the observatory. The silence between master and apprentice was filled with mutual respect, a quiet reverence not only for the work, but for the tradition they were upholding. Somewhere deeper in the library, a chime sounded, an ancient mechanism to mark the changing of shifts. Hecate gestured for Diodora to follow him down a narrow passage that led beneath the western wing. The path grew cooler, the air tinged with the scent of limestone and age. Here lay the subterranean archives, vaults of clay tablets and stone engravings, sealed in temperature-controlled chambers, a hidden world below a world. "This," he said softly, "is where Alexandria remembers what others have forgotten." They passed through rows of stone shelves, each marked by era, region, or tongue. There were slabs bearing Minoan script, fragments of Phoenician law, even early Celtic carvings etched into black volcanic rock. Diodora could not help but reach out a hand, tracing the indentations as if trying to read the language through her fingertips. "You said once that knowledge is a kind of fire," she murmured. Hecate nodded. "And here you see its embers." They spent the remainder of the morning cataloging recent donations, a set of scrolls in Etruscan, sealed in wax-lined boxes. Diodora sketched each symbol into her logbook while Hecate dictated their provenance. When they finally emerged into the upper halls, the light had shifted again. The library's rhythm was steady, constant, a rhythm older than empire, older than war. And still, within its heart, the stars waited to be read. The midday sun shimmered over Alexandria's tiled roofs, casting short shadows beneath the porticos of the library, while the streets of the city grew livelier with vendors and chatter. Within the marble walls of the great library, calm reigned. It was the hour when sunlight poured in through open atriums, illuminating the mosaics with a warm, living glow. In the garden court, an open-air space nestled between two wings of the library, green fig trees swayed gently above a reflecting pool. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender and jasmine. Benches of polished limestone lined the pathways, and scholars walked slowly, their voices low, discussing geometry, medicine, and the movements of the planets. Diodora sat on a stone step near the edge of the pool, watching a dragonfly skim the surface. In her lap lay a book she had just copied, a collection of parables from Mesopotamia. Her mind wandered, not in idleness, but in quiet reflection. Each story carried a lesson, and each lesson left behind a shadow of a question yet unanswered. Across the courtyard, a foreign diplomat was deep in conversation with a senior curator named Calixenus. The diplomat's robe bore the turquoise and gold trim of the Mauryan Empire, and his hands moved gracefully as he spoke in a dialect of Sanskrit. Calixenus, fluent in many tongues, responded in melodic Greek, guiding him toward a shaded alcove where Eastern scrolls were kept. The library was more than a sanctuary. It was a bridge between worlds. At that same moment, in the botanical gallery, Tanetti the herbalist led a group of apprentices through rows of terracotta planters. "Each of these," she said, brushing a hand over a flowering stem, "has been grown from seeds traded for books. This is knowledge grown from knowledge." She handed a leaf to one of the girls. "Crush this and inhale. What do you smell?" "Lemons," the girl replied, eyes wide. "Exactly. But this leaf does not grow near Alexandria. It came from across the Red Sea, and yet here it teaches us." Back in the main hall, Hecate examined a recently received manuscript written on treated leather. It had come from the city of Carthage and described a method for preserving food in desert climates. Simple knowledge, perhaps, but powerful. He scribbled a note in the library's ledger, cross-reference with Nabatean salt techniques. The day wore on gently, like a river flowing without urgency. The light through the upper oculi shifted slowly across the stone floors, casting long rectangles that marched like silent sentinels. Diodora rejoined Hecate later, bringing with her a small box of ink blocks she had ground by hand. "Shall we work on the annals?" she asked, eager and composed. "Yes," Hecate replied, his eyes soft with approval. "Today we add a page not from the past, but from the present." Together they unrolled a fresh scroll. At the top, in careful calligraphy, Diodora wrote the date in Greek numerals, followed by the phrase, "Contributions of Today," and beneath it they began to catalog the visitors, the discoveries, the questions asked, and the stories shared. In the Library of Alexandria, even the simplest moments were worthy of preservation. Even silence had meaning, and, as the scent of herbs drifted in on a gentle breeze, the library continued its eternal mission, to remember. That afternoon, a soft commotion arose near the entrance as a merchant from the island of Rhodes arrived bearing an ornate crate. Within it were tablets made of beeswax, inscribed with short poems and riddles that had been passed orally for generations. The merchant had no scholarly title, no affiliation, only a deep belief that these verses held value. Calixenus greeted him with the same respect he would show a king. "Wisdom does not wear a crown," he said, as the tablets were gently unpacked and catalogued. Meanwhile, in the quiet copyist's wing, the rhythmic scraping of styluses echoed like soft rainfall. A blind transcriber named Nimion worked by touch and memory, reciting texts aloud, so that his fellow scribes could write. His voice was smooth and steady, weaving stories into permanence. Diodora passed by, pausing to listen to a fragment from Hesiod's Works and Days, and found herself unexpectedly moved. Even the blind can see with words, she thought. In the adjacent atrium, an architect presented blueprints to a small group of urban planners and engineers. These were not just maps, but visions, proposals for aqueducts, sewage systems, and flood barriers. Though some ideas were impossible by current means, the mere act of imagining them gave them life. Tanetti wandered through the hall, drawn by the sound of a child's laughter. A young boy, son of one of the scholars, was playing with carved wooden letters, arranging them into imagined names and spells. She smiled and knelt beside him. "Do you know what these mean?" she asked. He shook his head. "They mean that nothing is ever truly lost," she whispered, "as long as someone remembers the shapes." By twilight, the library's gardens were golden with slanted light. Diodora returned once more to the reflecting pool, now motionless and glass-like. She closed her eyes, listening to the murmur of voices carried on the breeze, Greek, Aramaic, Coptic, Latin, a chorus of history, each voice adding to the endless dialogue. And in that moment, as shadows lengthened and lamps were lit anew, the Library of Alexandria stood as it always had, an eternal ember, glowing quietly against the oncoming night. As evening fell over Alexandria once more, the marble surfaces of the library turned a deep amber under the touch of twilight. The sky was brushed with soft hues of rose and indigo, and the breeze from the sea carried with it the scent of salt and distant jasmine fires. The city around the library softened, its noise dulled by the fading light, while within the pulse of knowledge remained constant. Tonight was a special night. Once every lunar cycle, the librarians held a private gathering known as the Convocation of the Scroll. It was not ceremonial in the public sense, no fanfare, no announcement, but for those within the library it was sacred, an evening to reflect on new acquisitions, to read aloud forgotten languages, and to let knowledge unfold without the pressure of purpose. Hecate, now dressed in a simple indigo robe, made his way to the central rotunda. There, a circular table had been set with low lamps and cushions for sitting. Scrolls from many lands were stacked with gentle care, their titles etched in gold, ink, or charcoal. He ran a hand along their spines and paused before one marked in an unfamiliar script, a gift from Nubia. He smiled. Tonight, this would be his voice. Diodora arrived moments later, a sprig of lavender braided into her hair. Her eyes were bright with anticipation. She loved these nights most of all, not because of the learning, but because of the listening. Tanetti joined them, bringing a pot of herbal infusion steeped with rose and mint. Others followed. Translators, herbalists, astronomers, poets. Each bore with them a scroll, a memory, a question. As the lamps were lit, casting long shadows on the dome above, the gathering began. Macaris, the aged philosopher, spoke first. He read from a fragment of Epicurus, then paused to muse about the nature of fear. "Is it knowledge that banishes fear?" he asked, "or only the familiarity of it?" Calixenus replied, "Perhaps fear is the echo of things we've yet to understand, and the library is the chamber where echoes grow quiet." The circle nodded, each lost briefly in thought. Then came the readings, a poem written in the Etruscan tongue, its cadence haunting even to those who didn't understand the words, a fragment from a lost Babylonian star chart, a treatise on laughter by an unknown philosopher of Lesbos. When it was Diodora's turn, she stood and unrolled a tiny, brittle scroll. "This," she said, "was found in a sealed jar near Cyrene. It contains only a single line. To remember is to live twice." Silence fell, a respectful, pregnant silence. Finally, Hecataeon read from the Nubian script. His voice was deep, careful, and slow, sounding out syllables never before spoken in those marble halls. Though few understood the words, the rhythm itself seemed to cast a spell. When he finished, no one spoke. Instead, they passed around the pot of herbal tea and sat with their thoughts. Above them, through the open oculus of the rotunda, the first stars blinked into view. And as the night deepened, the Library of Alexandria became not a place of study, but of communion, a sanctuary for the soul as much as for the mind. Later that night, after the convocation ended, Diodora wandered through the eastern wing of the library, where the Hall of Invention quietly slept beneath its domed ceiling. Here, engineers and dreamers had once recorded their diagrams, catapults, aqueducts, pulleys, devices for harnessing the wind. She ran her fingers across a mosaic floor tile, depicting a man lifting water with a spiral tube, an Archimedean screw. She lit a small lantern and sat near a pile of old sketches, many unsigned, their creators long forgotten. Still, their work remained. The candlelight revealed lines drawn with meticulous patience, visions of tools and bridges, the silent mechanics of human curiosity. She opened her journal and began sketching her own idea, a design for a mirror system that could redirect sunlight deeper into the underground vaults. She had no formal title, yet here, within these sacred halls, her thoughts mattered. Meanwhile, in the Chamber of Origins, Hecataeon made a solitary visit. The heavy doors creaked behind him as he stepped inside. He approached a pedestal upon which rested a stone slab with the oldest known inscription in the library, Proto-Egyptian, weathered and faint. He placed his hand upon it. "May we never forget," he whispered. The candlelight flickered, not from a draught, but as if in answer. In the quarters nearby, Tanetti recorded notes from the evening's discussion. She transcribed not only what was said, but what was felt, the tremble in Macaris's voice, the hush that followed Diodora's line, the shared warmth in the room. These were not facts. They were truths. By midnight, the library quieted once more. A guard paced slowly along the outer corridors, his torch a bobbing star in the gloom. Far across the city, the harbor lights shimmered like a necklace of flame across the water. Within, a new scroll was placed on the shelf, and as always, the library remembered. The next morning arrived quietly, shrouded in a thick coastal mist that clung to the streets and softened the sharp angles of the city. Alexandria awoke more slowly than usual, and so too did the library. The guards lit fewer torches, and the scribes moved through the halls with quieter steps, as if the day itself requested gentleness. Within the chamber of geometry, Diodora stood before a towering shelf, lined with parchments covered in diagrams, golden spirals, harmonic proportions, Euclidean proofs. The chamber was built like a musical instrument, its stone walls subtly curved so that sound would carry evenly, and even a whispered theorem could be heard across the room. She was studying an old scroll written by Archytas of Tarentum. The ink was fading, but the genius remained. Hecateion approached with a look of curiosity. "You favor the abstract today," he said. Diodora smiled. "There's something beautiful in the order of it. It reminds me that the world, chaotic as it seems, follows laws." Hecateion nodded and pointed to a diagram of nested shapes. "Even chaos has structure. Sometimes we simply lack the lens to see it." They worked side by side for hours, referencing commentaries from India and Babylon, tracing mathematical ideas across cultures and epochs. The library's true miracle, Diodora realized, wasn't just its knowledge. It was the conversations it made possible between people who had never met, across thousands of years. Elsewhere, in the epistolary hall, letters were being sorted. It was the room dedicated to correspondence, scrolls and clay tablets etched with ink or stylus from across the Mediterranean. Some were political reports, others trade records, a few were personal journals. A young assistant named Lysis was tasked with reading and cataloging the most recent arrivals. Today, one letter caught his attention. It was addressed simply to the keepers of thought. The parchment bore the markings of a far northern trader. Within it were descriptions of strange light in the night sky, ribbons of color flickering silently above a frozen sea. "Could it be the aurora?" Lysis whispered. He ran to the astronomy wing, scroll in hand, eager to compare the account with known celestial records. Back in the chamber of geometry, a small group of foreign visitors observed Diodora and Hecateion. They were artisans from Thessaly, curious about proportion and its use in architecture. One of them, a woman named Philina, spoke softly. "We build temples, but we do not always understand why they feel sacred." Hecateion replied, "Because the mind recognizes harmony even before it names it." Philina nodded, and for the rest of the morning, she and her companions stayed, listening, sketching, asking questions that stretched far beyond building. As noon approached, the library filled with a warm, golden light that filtered through the patterned screens and played on the stone floors. The mist outside had lifted, revealing the shimmering harbor and ships rocking gently in the tide. Lunch was taken quietly in the colonnades. Baskets of olives, flatbread, dried apricots, and soft cheese were passed around among scholars and visitors. There was little conversation, only the sound of pages turning and the occasional contented sigh. In the early afternoon, Hecateion led Diodora to a chamber she had never entered before, the room of mirrors. Inside, a dozen polished bronze plates were mounted on pillars in perfect alignment. When sunlight entered through a small circular window, it bounced from mirror to mirror, illuminating a sculpture at the room's center, a flame cast in white marble. "This room," Hecateion said, "was built to teach a single truth." "What truth?" Diodora asked. "That knowledge is light, and we are the mirrors." They stood in silence as the sculpture glowed in the shifting beams. In Alexandria, even the architecture spoke in parables. As the sun dipped further across the sky, casting longer shadows through the marble latticework, the library began its gentle descent into evening once again. In the room of mirrors, the last shaft of light kissed the sculpture's edge before vanishing entirely, and the chamber was dimmed, its secret glow fading like a remembered dream. Diodora and Hecateion left in quiet contemplation, their sandals echoing softly on the smooth stone floor. They returned to the central atrium, where a soft chorus of recitation drifted through the air. An elderly scribe named Thamon was teaching a group of apprentices to memorize poetry by rhythm alone. His voice rose and fell like the tide, steady and assured. Diodora sat nearby and listened, letting the cadence of the words fill the spaces in her mind. Poetry was the thread that bound the rational to the emotional, she thought, the bridge between what could be measured and what must be felt. In a nearby niche, a group of students gathered around a map, carved in relief on a limestone slab. It depicted the known world, with distant lands etched in delicate curves and faded names. One student pointed to a crescent-shaped island and asked, "Does anyone live there?" A librarian responded, "Perhaps, but if no one has written of them, they remain only a possibility." The thought lingered. By nightfall, lanterns were lit once again and placed in careful intervals along the walls and shelves. The architecture of the library seemed to come alive under their flickering light, shadows dancing in harmonious patterns across domed ceilings and carved columns. Before leaving, Diodora returned briefly to the chamber of geometry. She retrieved the scroll of Architas and gently returned it to its place. Then, as was custom, she wrote a short reflection in the ledger provided for all scholars. "Today, I learned that light needs form to be seen, and thought needs shape to be shared." She closed the book and stepped out into the night, the city of Alexandria glowing softly beneath the stars. And as she walked the quiet streets homeward, the words and wonders of the day traveled with her, echoing gently in the chambers of her mind, like the fading song of a place that never truly sleeps. By the 7th day of her routine in the library, Diodora had begun to feel its rhythm not only with her mind, but with her entire being. She woke each morning with the gentle hum of anticipation, as if a part of the library lived within her and called her back before the sun had fully risen. Today, her first destination was the Hall of Languages, a long, vaulted chamber filled with shelves of bilingual texts, translation keys, and comparative grammars. It was here that the library became a linguistic tapestry, with scrolls resting beside one another in dozens of tongues, Akkadian next to Aramaic, Latin paired with Demotic Egyptian, Phoenician with Punic. A visiting scholar from Gaul, an elder named Clovis, had brought with him a clay tablet with etchings no one had yet identified. Diodora and Calixenus stood beside him, puzzling over the characters, which looked like a mixture of runes and early Greek. They speculated, compared fragments, and debated origins. "Sometimes," Clovis remarked, "we are not meant to understand immediately. Sometimes a symbol must wait for its moment." Down the corridor, another scholar, a Nubian linguist named Aseta, was instructing a small group in tonal dialects. Her voice rose and fell like a song, the students repeating her cadences like an echo. She noticed Diodora listening and smiled. "Words," Aseta said, "are more than shapes. They are breath, intention, rhythm." In the adjoining alcove, an artist named Miletas was copying inscriptions from ancient columns onto new scrolls. His hand was steady, his lines precise. But what struck Diodora was that each copied word was surrounded by sketches, flowers, birds, vines. "Why do you decorate them?" she asked. "Because language is not a cage," he replied. "It is a garden." Later in the day, Hecateion invited Diodora to the repository of origins, where the library kept myths and cosmologies from around the world. Here were scrolls from far-off lands, stories of sky serpents, world trees, and rivers that formed from the footsteps of gods. "This is the heart," Hecateion said, "not of knowledge, but of belief." They read stories aloud, one from the Inuit about a sky woman who fell to earth, one from the Indus Valley about a sacred cow birthing the stars, and another from the Yoruba about the spider god who wove the universe "It is strange," Diodora said, "how different they are, and yet how similar." "Because all stories begin with wonder," Hecate replied. As the afternoon wore on, the chamber was filled with the murmur of legends, drifting between the pillars like incense, and Diodora began to understand that every scroll was not just a record, it was an offering. Before she left the repository, she added a page of her own, not a translation or a treatise, but a single line written in Greek. "Every breath we take is a story waiting to be told." Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting a honeyed glow through the archways. The library glowed in response, as if lit from within, and in that sacred light, surrounded by voices of the past and the hopeful murmur of the present, the boundaries between knowledge, myth, and poetry seemed to vanish. The library, like the soul, held room for them all. As twilight began to fall, Diodora returned to the Hall of Languages, drawn back by the clay tablet left by Clovis. She sat beside it, in thoughtful silence, the glyphs faintly glimmering under the lamplight. She imagined the hand that had carved them, centuries ago, maybe even longer, on a night not unlike this one, with nothing but oil light and a whisper of purpose. She retrieved a stylus and parchment and began to copy each character, not to translate yet, but to become familiar with their rhythm. Language was not merely meaning, it was music, and she would learn the notes. Elsewhere in the library, Aseta stood in front of a large mural depicting the Tower of Babel. She traced the painted bricks with her fingers, pausing where the paint had cracked and faded. Behind her, her students continued their practice, forming sentences in 3 languages simultaneously. They laughed as their tongues stumbled, but they persevered. The confusion of tongues was not a curse, Aseta told them. It was a gift. It gave us new ways to see. Meanwhile, in the scriptorium of myths, Hecate was placing new entries into the catalogue. One scroll was sealed with wax and marked with the symbol of the Eleusinian mysteries. He hesitated for a moment before breaking the seal. The script inside was strange, not in its form but in its ideas, rituals wrapped in metaphor, designed more to be felt than understood. He made a note in the margin, to be read not once, but many times. Diodora joined him later, and together they reviewed the list of myths from that day. The paper grew long, and their eyes weary, but the satisfaction of having gathered even a fraction more of the world's wonder was enough. They stepped out into the garden court once again, where jasmine bloomed beneath the moonlight, and the pool reflected the stars above. "There are so many languages," Diodora whispered. "Yes," Hecate said, "and still we understand each other." They sat together in silence as the night deepened around them, and the library, breathing with memory, glowing with thought, watched over them like an ancient friend, content in its endless task. And somewhere deep in its stone bones another page was turned. The library of Alexandria had many faces, its halls like organs of a great and living body, each with a purpose, each connected to the others by veins of knowledge. On the 8th day, Diodora found herself drawn to one of the least frequented parts of the library, the Vault of Memory. This chamber was deep and dimly lit, located beneath the eastern wing. Few visited it daily, for its contents were not recent works of scholarship or new scrolls, but records of the library itself, histories of its construction, the names of every architect, scholar, benefactor, and scribe who had passed through its marble corridors since its founding. A spiral staircase led her down, the walls etched with concentric rings of names in a dozen scripts. At the bottom, the air was cooler, touched with the scent of cedar and old parchment. Oil lamps flickered along narrow stone corridors lined with cabinets and scroll cubbies. Here she met Philostratus, the keeper of the vault. He was stooped with age, his beard a silver cascade, and his fingers permanently stained with ink. yet his memory was sharper than any blade. "Most come here only once," he said, his voice soft but precise. "They seek something of themselves." Diodora followed him through the narrow passages, marveling at the records, ledgers of scrolls lost in floods, stories of earthquakes, lists of materials traded for knowledge. But it was the wall of dedications that struck her most. Here, etched in brass, were thousands of lines, the names of those who had donated scrolls anonymously or offered their time in silence. It was a monument to the unseen hands that had built the library, not with marble or coin, but with belief. She placed her palm against one of the plates, the metal cool beneath her touch. "Is this the soul of the library?" she asked. Philostratus nodded. "It is memory that grants meaning. Knowledge without memory is dust on a shelf." They sat for a while at a small wooden table, and he told her the story of the first librarian, Zenodotus, who had invented the idea of cataloging by genre, and of Eratosthenes, who had calculated the Earth's circumference in this very building, not through magic, but through light, shadow, and reason. When she returned to the surface, Diodora felt as though she had carried something with her, not a scroll, but a weight of reverence. The rest of the day she spent in the Hall of Invention, recording a detailed account of her visit. She described the feeling of the vault, the scent, the light, the sound of Philostratus's voice. It was not a record for others. It was her own memory, made physical. That evening, Hecateion joined her. He read her account quietly and then smiled. "Now you understand why we remember," she nodded, "so that we may know who we are." Outside, Alexandria swayed gently in the sea breeze. Lamps lit the streets, and laughter echoed from taverns near the port. But within the library, the silence was sacred. For every whisper in its halls was the echo of 1,000 more, each one reaching back into time, like a hand outstretched through history, and the library, ancient and unyielding, caught them all. Later that night, after the library had closed to the public, Diodora remained, granted special permission to revisit the vault. She returned, not as a visitor, but as a participant, carrying with her a slim scroll she had written in secret over the course of many nights. It was titled simply On Wonder. In it, she had recorded her personal reflections, her awe at the meeting of distant minds, the sensation of entering rooms where silence itself seemed to breathe. It was not scholarly, it was a tribute. Philostratus accepted it without question. He opened a drawer marked Ephemerides, where personal accounts were kept, diaries, dreams, fragments of joy or grief. He placed her scroll beside dozens of others. "You are now part of our memory," he said. As Diodora left, she noticed a bronze plaque at the threshold of the vault. It was worn, nearly illegible, but she traced the lettering slowly and read, "To remember is not only to keep, but to honor." Elsewhere in the library, candles burned low, and the faint sound of a lyre drifted in from the garden courtyard. A young musician, perhaps a son of one of the scribes, practiced beneath the stars, his melody a quiet offering to the night. Hecateion, seated in the astronomical wing, noted new entries in the chart of lunar phases. He worked slowly, reverently, for each mark represented not only a scientific fact, but a reminder of the library's duty to preserve rhythms larger than itself. Above him, painted on the ceiling, was a mural of the firmament, its stars in gold leaf. He gazed up and smiled. "Even memory has constellations," he whispered. By midnight, the library rested, but unlike the city around it, its rest was not silence. It was listening, always listening, to thoughts, to dreams, to the slow turning of the world. And in the vault of memory, the breath of the past lingered like incense, fragile, invisible, eternal. The 9th day in the library of Alexandria began not with a scroll, but with a sound, the call of seabirds gliding over the harbor, their cries carrying through the open colonnades like a reminder of the world beyond the walls. Diodora paused on the library steps, watching the gulls dip and arc in the morning light. She carried with her a list of scrolls she hoped to find, accounts of early seafaring, trade routes traced by Phoenician ships, and the first recorded myths of ocean gods. Today, she would spend her hours in the nautical archive. The archive was a vaulted hall on the western side of the library complex. It smelled of sea salt and old papyrus, as many of its contents had arrived by ship and never left. Model ships hung from the ceiling, suspended by fine cords, each representing a vessel described in one of the texts below. Hecateon met her there, already deep in conversation with a visiting cartographer from Rhodes. Together, they unrolled a massive scroll that spanned 3 tables in length, an illustrated map of the known world's shorelines, complete with sea monsters drawn where knowledge failed. "See this cove here?" the Rhodian asked, pointing to a jagged edge of the coast near Anatolia. "It does not exist, and yet every sailor insists it's there." Diodora raised an eyebrow. A place remembered, or a place imagined? "Perhaps both," the man replied. As the morning sun climbed higher, the archive filled with quiet activity. Scribes copied old maritime logs. A group of children visiting from the city clustered around a mural showing a trireme in full sail. A librarian read aloud from the Odyssey, his voice rising and falling like a wave. By midday, Diodora found herself drawn to a side chamber, marked only with a faded symbol, a conch shell. Inside, she discovered a collection of sailors' journals, personal accounts, prayers scratched into bark, sketches of constellations and strange fish. One parchment in particular stood out. It was brittle, nearly falling apart, but the ink remained legible. It described a sailor's dream of a land where the sea sang lullabies and the stars whispered names. She copied it down carefully. For dreams, she thought, are the truest maps we have. In the afternoon, she joined a lesson being given on celestial navigation. An old scholar named Draken showed the students how to use a gnomon and how to read the wind from the curve of a sail's shadow. He looked at Diodora and said, "We do not sail with maps. We sail with memory." That evening, as dusk fell over the library and the sky turned a gentle violet, the lamps were lit one by one along the corridor. The models above swayed gently in the breeze, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Diodora lingered a while longer, staring at a globe etched with silver lines, routes traveled, storms weathered, returns never made. She thought of the sailors who had written those journals, of the stories left behind when a ship vanished into the horizon, and she understood. The library did not only collect knowledge, it collected longing for what lay just beyond the reach of understanding, for the shores never seen, for the voices nearly forgotten. And so the library waited, silently, patiently, like a lighthouse that never dimmed. Later that night, long after the lamps had been dimmed and the last footstep had echoed through the stone corridors, Diodora remained in the nautical archive. The walls breathed gently around her, as if the library itself was adrift in thought. She spread the sailor's parchment before her once more and lit a small oil lamp. The drawings, waves that curled like fingers, birds with human eyes, told not only a journey but a state of mind, a fragment of a life, spent between the certainty of land and the mystery of horizon. A sudden idea struck her. She opened her journal and began to draft a short story, a fiction, perhaps, or perhaps a truth in disguise. It followed a sailor who could hear the voices of lost ships carried on the wind. Each chapter ended with a single sentence, "And the sea remembers." In the quiet, Hecateon appeared beside her, a steaming bowl of lentil broth in his hands. "You forget to eat," he said gently. She smiled and accepted it. They sat together on the floor, backs against a shelf filled with navigation tools, sextants, sundials, crude compasses made from magnetite. He told her about the time the library once sent a delegation to Carthage to retrieve maps before a war erased them. They arrived too late, he said, but one sailor gave them directions from memory, and those directions live here now, memory again. It circled back in every room like a tide. As they ate in silence, the breeze carried the scent of salt and jasmine through the windows. Somewhere far away, a boat's horn sounded, a reminder that even the present never stops moving. Before she left, Diodora tucked her story draft inside a folder labeled Unfinished Voyages. It seemed the right place for it. The last thing she did was turn out the lamp. Darkness reclaimed the chamber, but she did not fear it, because within the library, even the dark had meaning. Even the silence spoke. On the 10th and final day, a hush deeper than usual fell over the library of Alexandria. It was as if the building itself sensed the approaching end of something, not an end in the dramatic sense, but the gentle closing of a circle. Diodora rose before dawn, her heart full with unspoken reflections. She dressed slowly, folded her journal, and made her way through the still sleeping city. The streets were draped in the soft gray light of early morning, and the library loomed in the distance like a sleeping colossus. She did not follow a plan that day. She let her feet guide her. They took her first to the garden court, where dew still clung to the leaves and the water basin mirrored the pale sky. She sat in silence beneath the fig trees and listened, not for words, but for presence. In time, Hecateion joined her. He said nothing, simply sat. Their silence was an affirmation of everything they had shared, the discoveries, the conversations, the laughter, and the reverence. No words were needed now. When the sun had fully risen, Diodora stood and walked to the central atrium. There she found a small group of scholars gathered around the column of Concord, a marble pillar inscribed with maxims from 100 cultures, each expressing the same core values in different voices: humility, wonder, patience, generosity. She touched the stone, feeling the etchings under her fingers. Her journey had begun here, she remembered, with uncertainty, with questions she hadn't even been able to name. And now, standing in the same place, she still had questions, but they no longer felt like voids. They felt like stars. She spent the remainder of the morning visiting her favorite chambers one by one. The Hall of Languages, where Aseta was conducting a lively debate. The Chamber of Geometry, where a child was being shown the golden ratio for the first time. The Repository of Origins, where a new scroll of myth had just arrived from Persia. Each room greeted her like an old friend. Each wall seemed to remember her steps. In the final hours of the afternoon, she entered the scriptorium. There, she composed her last entry in the visitor's register, not a report or reflection, but a letter. To the next wanderer, she wrote, "You will not find all the answers here, but you will learn how to look for them, and that is more than enough." She signed it simply, Diodora. As the sun dipped low, casting long golden lines across the polished stone, she walked to the great western doors. The keepers bowed their heads as she passed, and though she carried no scroll, no artifact, she felt heavier with something far more precious: understanding. She stepped out into the twilight, the breeze cool against her face. Behind her, the library stood illuminated, not with torches or lamps, but with the quiet light of every mind it had ever touched. The stars blinked awake overhead, and the story, like all the others kept within those sacred walls, was far from over. After stepping outside, Diodora didn't immediately descend the marble steps. Instead, she paused to look back once more. The great library doors were slowly closing, not with finality, but with grace, like a curtain falling after a masterful play, or the last page of a book sliding shut. She thought of all the lives intertwined within those walls, not just the famous thinkers whose names adorned monuments, but the silent ones, the scribes who copied page after page, the custodians who kept the lamps filled, the children who wandered in and left transformed. As the stars brightened above, Diodora walked along the outer wall, tracing her fingers across the warm stone. She passed a hidden courtyard where Jasmine climbed along the trellis, and then a small annex where musical instruments were kept for quiet night recitals. She could almost hear a harp being tuned, a song forming on invisible strings. A final detour brought her to the shoreline where the library met the edge of the city. The sea stretched before her, dark and endless, whispering in rhythms older than language. She sat on a smooth rock, pulled her shawl close, and took out her journal one last time. In it, she wrote a final line. The library is not a place. It is a way of seeing. With that, she closed the book and tied the string around it, sealing not only her entries, but a chapter of her life. Far in the distance, a ship passed silently through the harbor, its lanterns flickering like distant stars. Diodora watched until it became no more than a shadow against the waves, and then she stood, turned her face to the wind, and walked slowly into the night. Behind her, the library breathed on, eternal and unwavering, a lighthouse of knowledge and memory, waiting for the next soul to seek its light.